All right, everyone, this is Dr. Hathcock one more time, and this is our last lecture for the first half of American history. Today we're going to look at some key events of the U.S. Civil War. And I don't really go in depth in the battles, but we do talk about some things that happened and significant outcomes, particularly the Emancipation Proclamation. Also, we'll look a little bit at the year 1863 and how that was sort of the turning point of the Civil War. All right, now in looking at the Civil War, if you break it down and look at sort of the leadership structure of both sides, the North and the South, you'll see that the North did have an advantage in terms of political leadership, but the South really had an advantage in military leadership to an extent. All right, well, let's start by looking at political leadership and how Abraham Lincoln stacks up with Jefferson Davis. On paper, it would look like Jefferson Davis would be the better president here. Jeff Davis has actually been in the military, if you'll recall. He went to West Point. He was at the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican-American War. He'd also served as Secretary of War for President Pierce. So, yeah, on paper, it looks like Jeff Davis would be perfect for a wartime situation. But it turns out being president is about more than just strategies and X's and O's. Being president, really, more than anything, it's about inspiring people, giving them confidence. And, Jeff Davis did hold the Confederacy together for 4 years. I think that in of itself was a miracle. But I don't know. Jeff Davis was not able to inspire. It's a tough road. There'd be a lot of setbacks, especially 1864, 1865. It's pretty tough. But yeah, Jeff Davis just turned out to not be as inspiring as Abraham Lincoln. People talk of Southern pride and all that sort of stuff. I was born and raised in Texas, but they're at the end of the Civil War. Like these Confederate soldiers were deserting. They didn't want to fight anymore. They were running off to Mexico. They were hiding out. They'd had enough of this thing. There really wasn't that quote Southern pride on display there at the end of the war. So Jeff Davis did not do that great of a job of inspiring the people of the South to give that little extra effort to, be dedicated to the cause. Whereas Abraham Lincoln did a fantastic job of convincing the people of the North that it was a worthy cause and that it was worth the sacrifice. Lincoln earlier in his life, he didn't have any military experience at all. In fact, he said the closest he ever came to military experience was there was something called the Black Hawk War that broke out in Illinois when he was a young man. He and some of his, the young men that lived around him, they volunteered to go fight the Black Hawk. He said they marched through forests, and he said the only blood he shed in the whole thing was killing mosquitoes. They kept trying to bite him. But other than that, Lincoln never fired his gun in anger or anything during that whole thing. So that's it for Abraham Lincoln and military experience. But you know what? You've got generals who can do those things. You've got military strategists who can help you out. And really, being president is about giving speeches. It's about inspiring people to commit themselves to the cause. And in that regard, Abraham Lincoln was very good. He gave some of the greatest speeches in American history, period, not just for that time, but in American history. He just convinced the people of the North that it was a noble endeavor and that it was worth the sacrifice. By the way, if you think I'm lying to you, when we get to 1864 and the country holds a presidential election, right in the middle of a civil war, we held an election. He doesn't just win, he wins a re-election massively, big time. So that'll be proof that Lincoln was inspiring and that he did convince people that it was a noble sacrifice and worth the cause. All right, so in terms of political leadership, we give the advantage to the North. But then when you look at military leadership, especially early on in the war, it's absolutely advantage South. I'm going to pick on George McClellan here for just a minute. He's sort of representative of these Union generals of the North. Although to be fair, like Lincoln went through some 15 different generals before he found Ulysses S. Grant. But McClellan, as an early choice to lead the Union Army, I don't know, he hesitated a lot. He had to have numerical superiority before he would attack. He was really good at training an army. I give him that. I mean, he had those boys ready to march. Their boots were shined, their medals looked nice in parades. And he did train that Army of the Potomac how to fight, how to march, all that sort of stuff. It's just fighting was his problem. That's a bad trait to have, by the way, if you're a general in the military. That fighting is your problem. He just did not want to commit his men to an effort where they might get slaughtered or they might lose a lot of people. This sucks, but here it is. It's the truth. Look, men die in war. It's a horrible thing to be involved in. It really is. But for wars to be won, you have to make sacrifices. You have to commit men to battle. And McClellan would always hesitate. He just couldn't do it. Lincoln eventually replaced him, fired him, because he wasn't pressing, because he wouldn't come out and attack. But it's not just McClellan. Other men along the way, they had gone to West Point, they'd gone to military schools. These guys knew how to fight. But again, it took some 15 different picks before Lincoln eventually got to Ulysses S. Grant and someone who could stand up to Robert E. Lee. South's military leadership, you start that discussion with Robert E. Lee. He might be the best military mind this country's ever produced. And that's saying something. I'm fully aware of the guys in World War II, like Eisenhower and Bradley and Patton. Fully aware of Jack Pershing in World War I. But yeah, Robert E. Lee might be the best military mind our country's ever produced. He just knew what to do. Like, he could look at a battlefield and what was playing out, and he knew the right tactic. He knew the right move. He was brilliant in combat. He was brilliant on the battlefield. Sometimes like he would be outnumbered, and he would divide his army into two or three and go hit his enemy, and he'd have his enemy running. His enemy would have like twice as many soldiers, but Lee would hit him with these crazy moves, these genius strategies, and they'd be running back north trying to figure out what the heck had just happened and how they got hit so hard. So yeah, Lee was brilliant in combat. But it wasn't just Lee. The South had Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Jeb Stuart. These were some brilliant military minds that were all working together for the Confederacy. So in terms of military leadership, we give it an advantage to the South. But there at the end of the war, the North got better. Once Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to lead of the Union Army, this is in the summer of 1863, things began to turn around. The North began to win some battles. He will promote Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman will be marvelous in combat as well. But even with the promotion of Grant, I've got to be honest in saying this. Lee continued to win battles. He really did. He continued to beat Grant's army all throughout 1864. But there at the end, the problem for Lee in the South was they just didn't have the manpower to make the stand. You may have heard of this phrase throughout your life, the damn Yankees. That comes from the Civil War. And the saying was, there's just too many damn Yankees. They just they pop up out of nowhere. And then that was true in a sense that, every time Lee was beaten in a battle, he couldn't replace his losses. The men that he lost in those battles, they were gone. Whereas Grant, let's say there's a battle takes place, Grant loses 1,000 men in combat in an afternoon. Grant could have those 1,000 men replaced in a matter of days. He could send word back to Washington, D.C. to call up these reserves, and off they go. Lee doesn't have that. Every man who could fight and was willing to fight was in uniform, 1864 going into 1865. So Lee continued to win battles, but ultimately he lost the war because of manpower shortages. He just didn't have the reserves that Grant did. All right, so political leadership is advantage to the North. Military leadership, though, is advantage to the South. And in the early parts of the war, it really just to sort of get things moving here, Lee was winning battles. Lee was impressive. McClellan was hesitating and wouldn't attack. So early on in the war, especially 1861, Lee was beating McClellan and other Union generals along the way. But now let's advance to the year 1862. We're kind of getting into letter C, a higher cause. And there's this huge battle that takes place in mid-September of 1862, known as the Battle of Antietam. Now, Antietam is really more than anything, it's a situation where both sides lost. But to explain what happened at Antietam, Lee brought his army, excuse me, his Confederate army, out of Virginia and attacked into Maryland in September of 1862. Now, the reason why Lee did this, number one, was to take some pressure off of the South. To that point, the battles have been taking place mainly in Virginia. He felt like this would give Virginia farmers a chance to, harvest their crops, take some pressure off of them. But also Lee was hoping there in September of 1862 that if he could win some big battles in the state of Maryland, that the state of Maryland might secede from the Union. That if given that opportunity, Maryland would side with Lee and the Confederacy. You'll recall I was explaining to you guys that Lincoln couldn't let Maryland leave because if Maryland leaves, then the nation's capital is behind enemy lines. So if Lee could have pulled it off, if he could have won some big battles in Maryland, he really could have gotten Maryland to secede. At that point, Washington, D.C. is completely surrounded by the enemy. And that probably would have been game over at that point if Lee could have pulled that off. But what happened here at this Battle of Antietam was a draw. Neither side won. Everybody lost. And it was just a bloodbath at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam is still to this day the bloodiest 24-hour period in American history. Some 7,000 casualties at the Battle of Antietam. That's North and South combined, by the way, both sides. And God help us if we ever face a day where we're losing 7,000 Americans in one afternoon. That'd be a tough day for the country to accept. But anywho, after the Battle of Antietam, Lee is forced to retreat. He ran low on supplies, food, shot, powder, things like that. So Lee had to retreat after Antietam. It's not so much that he was beaten, he just had no choice but to retreat. And Lee gets out of Maryland. He makes his way back to Virginia. And so we just simply have a draw there at Antietam in September of 1862. Well, all the while, throughout that summer of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln was toying with the idea of something we'll call the Emancipation Proclamation. By that summer of 1862, President Lincoln realized that this war was going to last a pretty good long ways, that there would be more money spent, there would be more lives lost, and it was going to take a while. So President Lincoln felt that this war had to have a higher purpose or a higher cause, that it couldn't just be about ending rebellion down in the South. So he wanted to elevate the cause of the war to the destruction of slavery. So all throughout the summer of 1862, he worked on the original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. He kept this thing under tight security with a lock and key. He would walk over to the War Department there in Washington, D.C., where there would always be a young man standing guard in front of this locker. Lincoln would go up to the locker. He was the only man who had a key to it. He would open it up. He would take out the paper. He'd sit at a desk and he'd start writing, and that armed guard would stand at the doorway to make sure that nobody could come in. He didn't want anybody to know what he was working on. Then later that summer of 1862, Lincoln gave the rough draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his advisors. He held a cabinet meeting. That means the Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, all those guys are sitting in the room. They read the Emancipation Proclamation, and to a man, they all agreed with it. They all said that it was a good idea, that they stood with the president on his decision. But it was, our Secretary of War, a fellow by the name of Stanton. Secretary of War Stanton said, I do agree with what you're trying to do there, but he said, I think you should hold on to it and wait. Stanton said, we're not really winning this war right now. Lee and the South are getting all the headlines. And Stanton said, if you issue that now, it looks like a desperate act by a desperate people. He said, you should instead wait till the tide turns, till we start to win. Then you can sort of issue it from a position of strength. And it doesn't look like a desperate move. Lincoln agreed with that assessment. He thought that was a really good advice that Stanton had given him. So Lincoln kept it under lock and key. He waited for the tide to turn. He waited for some victories, and he kept waiting. But then finally, in September of 1862, Antietam took place. And I just explained to you that Antietam was a draw. Nobody won. In fact, everybody lost. But Lincoln said the fact that Lee is running the other way, the fact that Lee is headed back to Virginia, he said it's good enough for me. So Abraham Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation just days after the Battle of Antietam was over. I think he was itching. He couldn't wait. He wanted to let it out there. And he considered Antietam to be good enough of victory, air quote the heck out of victory, to issue the proclamation. All right, well, in September of 1862, Lincoln lets this be known to the world. The newspapers get it. The message travels down to the South as well. And in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said that the South had 100 days to consider this final offer. As it turns out, 100 days later, it would be January the 1st, 1863. So it's, the numbers work there. It's probably also got something to do with why he issued it at that point. But he said the South had 100 days to reconsider. And that if the South would stop the war and lay down its arms, then these southern states could return to the Union as is, and that they could keep their slaves, but that after 100 days, if the offer had not been taken, then the federal government would view all slaves living behind enemy lines as free by the United States government. So if the South will put down its arms and rejoin the Union, they can keep their slaves. They can come back like nothing happened. They got 100 days to consider that offer. But if they have not taken that offer by January the 1st, 1863, then the government will view all slaves living behind enemy lines as free by the United States government. January the 1st, 1863 came and went. Not a single southern state took the offer. So at that point on January the 1st, 1863, it was now a war to end slavery. It wasn't just a war to preserve the Union. It also became a war to destroy slavery. Like I told you guys in our last lecture, at that point, Europe backs off from this conflict. Now that it's a war to destroy slavery, Europe begins to back away. But just some more details about all this. Let's see. Not all slaves were living behind enemy lines, if you'll recall. There were slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, but those states were not behind enemy lines. In fact, they were right there in the Union ranks. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. I've always tried to tell my students it freed like 80% of all the slaves. But there were still slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware that it didn't apply to. Also, truth be told, by that point, the Union Army had captured New Orleans, Louisiana, sort of that southern, real deep southern part of Louisiana. So those slaves that were living in New Orleans on down south in Louisiana, they weren't freed by the proclamation either. That's why at the end of the war, there would be a 13th Amendment to the Constitution that sort of took care of any and all loopholes that may exist and ended slavery altogether. Here's another truth. As the war was coming to an end, Abraham Lincoln was afraid that, with the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves that lived behind enemy lines, he was afraid that once the war was over with, the Supreme Court might say, well, technically slaves are private property and you have to return private property to its owners. We don't know if that ever would have come to be because the 13th Amendment took care of it altogether. But that was a real concern near the war's end. That as the war came to an end, the Supreme Court might say, well, Emancipation Proclamation is illegal to begin with. Slave property should be returned to its rightful owners down south. So yes, it's like the Emancipation Proclamation starts the process, but the 13th Amendment to the Constitution ultimately is what's going to go on to free the slaves. Here's another point to make. Okay, so it's January the 2nd, 1863. It's not like people in Alabama woke up that day and said, well, my God, we've been so wrong for so long. We have to free all of our slaves now because President Lincoln said so. No, there wasn't a single slave freed that day, January 1st, January 2nd, 1863. What happens is, as the Union Army advances, as the Union Army liberates these parts of the South, ends the rebellion in those parts of the South, that's where the slaves are freed. What it took from that point going forward was this: the advancement of the Union Army combined with the courage of the slaves to run. Slaves would run away to freedom. They would run to Union lines. And once they got away, they were free, forever free. So the Emancipation Proclamation starts the process of the destruction of slavery in the United States. But ultimately, it will take the 13th Amendment to make that thing stick, to make it legal and binding forever. All right, well, now let's take a moment to look at some key battles in 1863 and how the war began to turn more towards the Union side than, say, the South. All right, the first big battle to look at here in 1863 is the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll be focusing on the top right-hand map there. But Gettysburg is largely considered to be the biggest battle of the U.S. Civil War. It starts on July 1st, 1863. Excuse me, and that it's Gettysburg. Really, it's just chance. There was a factory there in Gettysburg that made boots. And Lee's army was up in Pennsylvania at this point because Lee is trying to draw the enemy out. He wants to have one big classic battle. Lee's thinking is if he can defeat the Union Army somewhere on the field of battle up in Pennsylvania, then there would be nothing left to oppose him, and he could march straight on to Washington, D.C. So Lee's up in the north in the summer of 1863 in Pennsylvania, causing problems, raiding supplies, because he's trying to get the Union Army to come out and face him. His hope is that once he can draw them out, he can defeat them in battle. And once defeated, there would be nothing to oppose Lee marching straight on to Washington, D.C. Then he could surround the nation's capital and try to force a surrender. But, who knows if that would have worked or not. Lee's a brilliant guy on the battlefield. He may have could have pulled that off. But on that map, you see we've got some red lines on the left-hand side. We've got blue lines kind of in the middle. That blue line is the only thing that stands between Lee and Washington, D.C. at that moment there in July of 1863. But back to this boot factory there in Gettysburg. Lee's army had been marching so much that a lot of those boys, they wore their boots out. They had holes in their boots. So they heard that there are boots in this thing called Gettysburg, and they went charging into the town, dead set on raiding and stealing from that factory. Some Union soldiers saw a bunch of rebels running towards the place. So, Union soldiers started to fire back. The Confederates took cover and fired back, and both sides started shooting each other on the outskirts of Gettysburg. At some point, the scouts notified the leaders. Everyone's headed that way. So because some guys were running to steal some boots out of a factory in Gettysburg, everybody's headed that way. And then on July 1st, 1863, we have the first series of battles there on the outskirts of the city of Gettysburg. The first battles at Gettysburg took place on the what would be the blue line's left-hand side, the Union Army's left flank. You can see there kind of at the bottom of that map on the right-hand side, there are some hill positions. There's the big top and the little round top. Well, that fighting on that first day was about trying to take those high positions, those hills. Especially at this point in time. Well, this is even true in today's warfare. If you control the high ground, you control the battlefield. Right here in 1863, the high ground is things like hills and mountains. Here in the year 2020, the high ground is outer space and satellites and drones and things, right? Well, let's go back to 1863. Some really intense fighting there on the Big Round Top in particular. It got down to a point where the Union Army on the extreme left flank, they didn't have any shot powder left, and they were reduced to using rocks and bayonets and knives to defend the Big Round Top. But they held. The left flank of the Union Army did hold there on July 1st, 1863. So they command the high ground. Lee is defeated on day one. But then on day two, July 2nd, Lee's army tried to attack to the right-hand side of the Union flank. You'll notice that the blue line kind of looks like a hook, right? Like a fish hook or something. If you look at the top of the hook or the bend in the hook, you can see that location, Cemetery Hill. Well, Lee's army tried to attack there on the second day, July 2, 1863. Really intense fighting there as well, but they were pushed back. Lee's army did not win on the second day of the battle. So day one, Lee tried to hit the left. It didn't work. Day two, he tried to hit the right. That didn't work. So day three, July 3, 1863, is it's the defining moment of the battle. As Lee decides to attack full frontal assault right up the middle. Lee is going to send an entire division of men. You can see there in the middle of the map those big 3 red arrows. It's forever known as Pickett's Charge. Excuse me. Lee decided that he would attack right up the middle, right into the teeth of the Union Army. At this point, Lee has never really lost a battle. He may have lost, like smaller battles, like at Big Round Top, at Cemetery Hill. But he hasn't really lost a campaign at this point. There's a lot of people who look at this and say that Lee thought he was unbeatable. He thought that he could do no wrong. There might have been a bit of arrogance to Lee in what he did on July 3, 1863. Some of his main advisors, James Longstreet in particular, told him not to do it. He said, "This is a horrible location. If we do this, we're going to lose a lot of men." But Lee disagreed, and Lee orders Pickett's Charge right into the teeth of the Union Army. What he asked was those boys to march across what was essentially a wide open field, about 400 yards in length, and that by the time those boys even did reach the Union Army, there was a rock formation where the Union soldiers had taken up their positions, and they had complete cover. As Pickett's Charge went across that wide open field, they just got decimated. Cannon fire, artillery fire, all that stuff was hitting them. Once they got within range, the Union Army opened up its rifles and just blew those boys to bits. And it was a huge mistake by Lee, what he did there on July 3rd, 1863. And that really is a huge turning point in this war. Lee lost. Lee was defeated at Gettysburg. There's no two ways to put it. And after that horrible battle at Pickett's Charge, you put together the 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg, and you have 42,000 casualties. Now, casualties are dead, wounded, missing. So it's not just that 42,000 died at Gettysburg. No, 42,000 people either died, were wounded, or went missing after the Battle of Gettysburg. That's both sides over a 3-day period. It's just a bloody mess after Gettysburg. Well, on July 4th, 1863, Lee has no choice but to retreat. He'll slip out of Gettysburg. He'll make his way back to Virginia. And Gettysburg matters for a handful of reasons. Let's try to look at the significant outcomes here of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Significant outcome number one is that Lee is human. He's not a magician. He's not a wizard. He can be beat. So Gettysburg was proof that Lee was human and he could lose. That's a huge morale boost for people up north who really thought this guy was indestructible. So number one, it's proof that Lee is human. Number two, it's as far north as the war will ever go. The war, in fact, won't be fought in the north anymore. It'll be fought entirely down south after Gettysburg. So significance number two, it's as far north as the war goes. From here on, it's just completely fought down south. Significance number three, Washington, D.C. is safe. This is as close as she ever really comes from here on to being threatened in any way. So Washington, D.C. is safe as well. All right, so Lee's human. The rest of the war will be fought down south, and our nation's capital is safe and sound, thank you very much, after the battle here at Gettysburg. That next day, July 4, 1863, that's Independence Day. And what an Independence Day celebration for the country. To know that Lee had been defeated, to know that he was retreating back to Virginia, that's quite a big celebration there on July 4, 1863, because of Gettysburg. And on that exact same day, on another part of the continent, another big battle would be coming to an end. And let's move on to our second battle here. Let's look at Vicksburg, that takes place in Mississippi, right there along the Mississippi River. Now I'm looking at the battle map on the left-hand side, labeled Vicksburg. And Vicksburg is in Mississippi. And to that point, say the spring of 1863, the Union Army controls all of the Mississippi River, except for that city of Vicksburg. Vicksburg became the key to the Mississippi River. If the Union Army could capture the city of Vicksburg, it could control the entire Mississippi River. And that matters because if they could capture Vicksburg, they will essentially divide the South in two. Let's see, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas would be completely cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. So if you could win at Vicksburg and you could divide the South, after having divided the South, you could then conquer the South, is the idea. So this is all about divide and conquer, trying to capture the city of Vicksburg. You can see that crazy bend in the Mississippi River. If you look in the middle of our map, on the outskirts of Vicksburg itself, the Union gunboats could go up the river no problem, but once they turned that bend, they couldn't elevate their guns high enough to hit the city of Vicksburg up top. Vicksburg sort of straddles the side of a hilltop, and those Union guns couldn't elevate that high to hit down that low. Also, there in Vicksburg, they had heavy guns all along the hillside that could fire down on those Union gunboats there in the river. Vicksburg was like an impenetrable fortress. It just couldn't be cracked. A few generals had tried before the spring of 1863 to capture the city, and they had all failed. So then this gentleman named Ulysses S. Grant was given the task of capturing Vicksburg. Grant's there on the bottom right of our slide. That guy standing there leaning against a tree. U.S. Grant to this point has been doing a magnificent job in this war. Had done some great fighting in the state of Tennessee. Had captured some major forts and riverways in that state. And here we are in July of 1863. Grant's given the task of capturing what seems to be an impossible thing, the city of Vicksburg. I think Grant's greatest attribute was just his common sense. He was a very practical man. He could look at a situation and he would say, okay, well, this is what needs to happen. And he could make that happen. Lee's great at strategy and grand ideas and comes up with these crazy plans and pulls them off. Grant's really more straightforward, matter of fact, this is what we do. And Grant, in assessing the situation here in Vicksburg, says, rather than attack the city straight on, which is almost a suicide attempt, you're going to lose a lot of men. Instead of doing that, we should just surround Vicksburg and nothing goes in, nothing goes out. Just control the city and starve them out. We're going to lay siege, that's spelled S-I-E-G-E, siege to the city of Vicksburg. So that from May of 1863 on through to early July of 1863, The city of Vicksburg was completely surrounded. Nothing got in, nothing got out. And as a result, by the time you get to late June of 1863, people in the city of Vicksburg are starting to starve. They were reduced to eating rats and sawdust and all kinds of nasty things to survive. A lot of the people living in Vicksburg had gone underground. They themselves were living like rats. They dug out holes under their homes, and they had to go underground because of the constant bombardment by the Union Army on land, anyway, not from the water. But if you look to the right of Vicksburg, you can see the Union Army's right at the gates. They were hitting it from land all around. Well, finally, on July 4th, 1863, the mayor of Vicksburg came out waving a white flag. He met with General Grant and surrendered his city to the Union Army. So on July 4th, 1863, as Lee is retreating from Gettysburg back to Virginia, U.S. Grant is accepting the surrender of the city of Vicksburg there along the Mississippi River. So that's a heck of a July 4th, 1863, as two major battles in the Civil War are coming to an end. By the way, the people of Vicksburg wouldn't celebrate the 4th of July for like another 100 years. No fireworks or barbecues or anything because of their surrender here on July 4, 1863. All right, well, Vicksburg is significant because, number one, the Union Army now controls the entirety of the Mississippi River. So they control the highway of North America, if you will. Which means that, number two, significance, the South is now divided in two. Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas are cut off from the rest of the South. And significance number three, Ulysses S. Grant is now a bona fide star in the Union Army. He pulled off the impossible. And his reward for pulling off the impossible was to be recalled to Washington, D.C. He traveled by train back to the nation's capital, where he would meet with, he actually traveled by boat most of the way, then by train on to Washington, D.C., where he met over a few days with President Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln wanted to get to know the man. He wanted to kind of get to know him and know if he could trust him. And after meeting with Grant for a few days, Lincoln said that his trust in the man was marrow deep. Not bone deep. It went even deeper than the bone. It went marrow deep. And he will promote Ulysses S. Grant to full commander of the Union Army. So Grant pulled off the impossible by capturing Vicksburg. He's now given the command of the entire Union Army. And now he is going to be asked to pull off another impossible task. He's the guy who's going to have to defeat Robert E. Lee. As it turns out, Grant's very matter-of-fact, practical approach not only wins Vicksburg, but it's ultimately going to defeat Lee as well and win the Civil War. Our third and final battle to look at is Chattanooga, Tennessee. Don't have a battle map up, but just to explain it in just straightforward terms. With the victory at Chattanooga by the Union Army in 1863, the state of Tennessee was completely knocked out of the war. Tennessee fell into Union hands by the end of 1863. Capturing Chattanooga then meant that the Union Army could use Tennessee as a staging point for further invasions. I'm going to go ahead and pull up this next slide because it has a map that's going to help us in figuring out Tennessee and why it's important. But if you look over here on the top right-hand side at our election map, you'll see the state of Tennessee is right below Kentucky. Kentucky's in red there in the middle. Look below Kentucky, there's T-E-N-N. You'll see that Tennessee is connected to Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. Capturing Tennessee means that you can basically invade anywhere you want at that point. For real, just throw a dart at a board and figure out where the heck it is you're going to go. So with Tennessee, the Union Army has a staging ground for further invasions into the South. All right, so the tide is turned by the end of 1863. With the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Chattanooga, this war very much now has the momentum on the side of the North. It's just a matter really of can they continue to string those victories together and put the pressure on to force the South to surrender. And 1864, as it turns out, would be a really big year in ending the war. So let's start by looking at the election of 1864 and how that all played out. Well, when 1864 started, President Lincoln did not like his prospects of winning the election, of winning a re-election. At this point, the body bags are really starting to pile up. The casualties are just enormous. Remember Gettysburg, 42,000 casualties over 3 days. That's North and South, though. And again, it's not just dead. It's dead, wounded, missing. But this war is just dragging on. There's a lot of men dying. And Lincoln was very afraid that he would lose the election of 1864. But then some things happened that year that would prove to be advantageous to the North and would lead the people of the North to believe in President Lincoln, who all along the way is giving great speeches, inspiring people to the cause. He really shouldn't have been so downcast about his prospects of winning the war. The American people really were behind their president. But okay, in looking at the election of 1864, the first thing to look at is this fellow named Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, and his march all the way to the sea. On the left-hand side at the bottom, you'll see there's Sherman. He is one of the most honoriest, fightingest men to have ever worn a uniform. And Sherman decided to take his army out of the Union Army out of Tennessee and basically lay a swath of destruction across the state of Georgia. If you look back on your election map, Georgia is GA. You can see how it's connected to Tennessee. And just imagine a mile-wide swath of destruction right through the heart of that state. And wherever Sherman's army went, it destroyed everything. It destroyed buildings, homes, railroads. It stole food from the land to feed itself, killed hogs, chickens, everything in its path. And he just made war all hell on those people, as he put it, because he wanted to teach them to never secede from the Union ever again. Like even in today's world in Georgia, the name Sherman is a cuss word. People don't talk about this guy because he put a whooping on them here in 1864. He would eventually surround the city of Atlanta. He didn't burn Atlanta to the ground. The Confederates actually started that fire. They were trying to destroy some of their weapons before the Union Army could get their hands on it. The fire that they set got out of control, and next thing you know, the whole city of Atlanta is burning. He didn't start that fire. The Confederates did, but he'll capture Atlanta. Then later on, he'll march all the way to the ocean, to the sea, where he'll capture the port city of Savannah, Georgia. Captured the city of Savannah just in time for Christmas. He and his men would stay in Savannah throughout the holidays, being resupplied from the ocean by the Union Navy. Then later in 1865, Sherman pushed his boys up into South Carolina. He eventually pushed his army up into North Carolina. I think he alone could have marched on Virginia, but the war came to an end. So Sherman was a really good military commander. And once he tore through Georgia, he effectively knocked Georgia out of the war. And really, at that point, the South was divided into three. Vicksburg had divided her into two. But once you knocked Georgia out, the South was essentially divided into three. But really, this war came down to the next point, point number 2 of Grant versus Lee. Throughout 1864, Ulysses S. Grant stuck to Lee, and he just wouldn't let him retreat, wouldn't let him move. Grant, in assuming total command of the Union Army, he kind of took on this policy. He said, look, you'll have to forgive the 14, 15 generals who came before me. They were intelligent men. They knew what they were doing. They just couldn't stack up to Robert E. Lee. And Grant, matter-of-factly, says, I'm not on that level. But no one is. No one else is on that level of Lee. He's brilliant. He's brilliant beyond anyone else. So Grant said, rather than come up with some exotic plan or some haymaker move, Grant said, I'm just going to take a matter-of-fact, practical approach. Grant said, I'm just going to continue to engage him. If Lee turns one way, I follow. If Lee turns another way, I follow that way. And Grant said, my approach will be to just put pressure on him every day, attack him every day, to be relentless, to not let up, and to basically just bludgeon Lee's army to death. Now, every time these two armies hit, Grant versus Lee, it was like two hammers striking each other. And in those strikes, thousands of men would die. You know, these battles would take place where Lee would lose 500, Grant would lose 1,000. And technically, that's a victory for Lee's army. But like I explained earlier, Lee couldn't replace those 500 men that he had lost. Everyone in the South who could fight was in uniform and was fighting. Meanwhile, Grant, same battle, lost 1,000 men. For reals, he could have like 2,000 men in his army, 5 days later. He could just wire back that he needs more reinforcements, and away they go. So the North had the numbers, the North had the manpower that the South did not. Grant knew that, and he just bludgeoned Lee's army to death. And in that policy, thousands of young men would die. It's the reason why this is the bloodiest war in American history, with some 700,000 dead when it's all said and done. But Grant knew that he could replace his losses and Lee could not. It earned him the nickname the Butcher. The newspapers called him just this evil man who sent thousands of boys to die every day. But Grant said it's the only way you're going to beat Robert E. Lee. And it's the only way you're going to win this war. Grant said, we could prolong this thing. We could just stretch it out. But he said if we do that, the people of the North will lose a stomach for the fight. Instead, he said, no, we have to put the pressure on. We have to keep to engage. We have to fight. And that's the only way you're going to beat Robert E. Lee is if you bludgeon his army to death. Well, even with the body bags, it was obvious to people living up north that there was progress being made. That Georgia had been knocked out of the war, that Grant was putting Lee's army under pressure, that Lee was slowly but surely withering away. So in November of 1864, President Lincoln wins and wins big. 91% of the electoral vote. Now, I get it, the South didn't partake in this campaign, this election. They can't, right? They've seceded. But 91% of the people who live in the North will vote for President Abraham Lincoln for his reelection. His opponent in this campaign, the Democrat McClellan, you saw his picture earlier. He's George McClellan. He's the guy who Lincoln had to fire because he wouldn't attack, would always hesitate. George McClellan ran for the Democrats here in 1864 and was soundly defeated. So Lincoln will be reelected. This war really is coming to an end. By the end of 1864, really the only question left is how many more men had to die before this god-awful mess came to an end. Here's a better map showing you Sherman as he came out of Tennessee. You can see he goes on to Atlanta. Then he'll go on down to the city of Savannah by December 22nd there, 1864. His boys camp out there in Savannah, and then you can see he moves on into South Carolina. Then the boys move on to North Carolina. And like I said, I really think he could have just marched on Virginia and ended everything. But the war would come to an end later on in 1865. And really, this war does come down to this. It's Grant versus Lee. And who's going to win that war? All right, well, in bringing the war to an end, by April of 1865, it's pretty clear that this thing is over. And in April of 1865, Lee is trying to get his army out of Virginia. What he wanted him to do more than anything else, excuse me, moving some things around here. What he wanted to do more than anything else was try to get out of Virginia and continue to wage the war from another location. He talked about going even further south and just continuing to fight the war from a new location. But it became very clear by April of 1865 that this thing was all but over. So Lee, in attempting to break out, realized that he was completely surrounded by Grant's army. There really was no breaking out of the state of Virginia. So on April the 7th, on April the 9th. It's on April the 9th. On April the 9th, Robert E. Lee will meet with Ulysses S. Grant to discuss surrendering his army. The place they'll meet is a little city called Appomattox Courthouse. They didn't meet in a courthouse located in Appomattox, like literally the name of the town. is Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. They'll meet in the parlor of a fellow by the name of Wilbur McLean. You can see on the top right-hand side, that's an artist's painting of the surrender. But at this surrender, this is a sort of a feel-good moment of the Civil War. Grant was very kind to Lee. He was very gracious. Grant asked Lee if his men were hungry. Lee said that they were. Grant immediately ordered that food be brought to the Confederate lines so that Lee's men could eat. Grant explained to Lee that all he had to do was get his men to swear an oath of loyalty to the Union. And they could actually keep their guns, but they had to go home. They had to swear an oath of loyalty to the Union and disband and go home. Lee said that all those things were very gracious of Grant to consider. Lee accepted those terms of surrender. So on April the 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant. With that, it's a big moment. Now, the war itself technically is not over. But Lee is defeated. In essence, the state of Virginia is defeated. And yeah, that's a big moment, the surrender of Lee at Appomattox Courthouse towards the end of the war. With that, it touched off celebrations across the North. There really was a sense of euphoria. And yeah, there was a feeling that it's all but over at that point. The war was coming to an end. All right, looking at our next point, Lincoln's assassination. It's just a horrible tragedy here at the end of the U.S. Civil War. But there's this guy named John Wilkes Booth. In our painting on the bottom left-hand side of our slide, you can see the guy behind President Lincoln. He's got a pistol in one hand and a dagger in the other. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. In fact, his father had been an actor. He grew up to be an actor. And he was a Virginian, John Wilkes Booth was. And with Lee's surrender, John Wilkes Booth was just distraught. He really was drinking a lot. He was very upset. And he decided to avenge the South, to avenge Virginia, by killing President Lincoln. Now, actually, there was a huge plot that night. It wasn't just that Booth was going to go after the president. Some of his colleagues, some guys who were in on this plot with Booth, they went after the leadership structure of the Union, of the country. An attempt was made on the vice president's life that night. Secretary of State Seward was injured. He got stabbed by a guy, but he would survive. The other people involved in these assassination attempts kind of just, they got cold feet. They didn't go through with it. But there's actually a huge plot that night, not just to take out Lincoln, but to take out his advisors, his vice president, and things like that. But the only one who successfully pulled off what they were out to do was John Wilkes Booth. It was April the 14th, 1865. Just a few days before Lee had surrendered to Grant. The nation's in a state of euphoria at that point. It feels like the war's coming to an end. Lincoln goes to see a play at the Ford's Theater there in Washington, D.C. Our American Cousin was the name of the play. I'm sorry, My American Cousin was the name of the play. And that John Wilkes Booth should be in the Ford's Theater was not a strange thing. He was in that theater all the time. He was an actor, So when he was walking around in the theater, it didn't set off alarms. There wasn't a feeling of this strange guy shouldn't be here. But the fact that he was an actor, he was known at the theater, gave him access to locations. He manages to get towards the stairs that will lead up to the president's balcony section. He kind of walks up real quietly, very slowly opens up the door, kind of creeps in, gets to point blank range behind the president, and pulls out a pistol and fires a shot into the back of the president's head. Booth then jumped from the balcony section. His spurs of his boot actually got caught on that flag that you can see draped there. It caused him to fall awkwardly, and then when he landed on the stage, he'd broken his leg. He yelled as he ran off of the stage, "Sic semper tyrannis," death to tyrants is what it translates. And he goes off into the night. He manages to escape for that moment. Confusion and panic set in the theater itself. The president's body was taken to a boarding house across the street from the Ford's Theater. Believe it or not, he didn't die immediately. His body kept breathing throughout that night. But later that next morning, April the 15th, his body did eventually give in. He stopped breathing, and the president passed. And with that, we have the death of the president. He's been assassinated here in April of 1865. And I promise you that John Wilkes Booth did not do the South any favors by assassinating this man. Lincoln was the one guy who really sort of understood things from a North-South perspective. I believe he is the one guy who would have brought about a much more easier peace. It wouldn't have lasted as long or been as harsh as Reconstruction was. That's the post-war peace, is Reconstruction. If Lincoln had lived, even there before he passed away, radical Republicans within his own party were coming up with all manner of ideas like hang the Confederate leaders, punish the South for what they've done. Lincoln was talking about he didn't want any retribution. He didn't want anyone hanged. In his second inaugural address, he had called for malice towards none and charity for all. So he's looking for an easy charitable peace, really, after the war. But with him gone, those radical elements took over the Republican Party. And the peace after the war for the South will not be an easy peace. It'll be harsh, and it'll last for years to come. A few days later, though, John Wilkes Booth was found. He was hiding in a barn. He was arrested, and he was summarily executed. He was hanged. Not only was he hanged, but those co-conspirators, at least the ones they knew about anyway, they were hanged as well. And here's a real tragedy in all this. There was a doctor by the name of Mudd, M-U-D-D, Dr. Mudd. He took in John Wilkes Booth and he worked on his leg. He didn't know that this guy had assassinated the president. He didn't know that this was a wanted man. But Dr. Mudd was also hanged for having taken care of John Wilkes Booth and tending to his broken leg. Down there on the bottom right, we have the funeral procession going through the streets of New York. Actually, his body was taken all across the north, traveled by train till it got all the way out to Springfield, Illinois. The president was buried there in Springfield, Illinois, where his grave has been ever since. Somewhere in that photograph is a very young Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt said he remembered watching as the funeral procession went down that street there in New York City. He was with his father and uncle watching out the window as the president's body was marched down the street. But it's just a horrible, horrible event that takes place here at the end of the war. All right, the results of the war. Number one, the Union is preserved. The North and South are brought back together because of the war. What are we? One nation under God, indivisible. And even though folks up north talk different from folks down south, we are still all of us Americans, the last I checked. So number one, it is preservation of the Union. The country is held together. Second result of the war, slavery is all but destroyed. Like I've been explaining to you guys, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves living behind enemy lines. But not all the slaves were living behind enemy lines. But at the end of the war, we do get passage of the 13th Amendment. It'll be fully ratified in December of 1865. And with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, it is illegal to hold anyone as a slave. All right, so with this war, you have the Union held together, preservation of the Union, and you also have the destruction of slavery in the United States. After the war, something called Reconstruction will take place. Reconstruction will last 12 long years. It'll just add to the bitter feelings between the North and the South for generations to come. And Reconstruction was just a god-awful mess that I believe could have been avoided. I think if President Lincoln had survived, it would have been malice towards none and charity for all. Also, I want to say on that point that Lincoln was serious about enfranchising African Americans who had served in combat. That means giving people the right to vote. Lincoln publicly, before he passed away, talked about African American rights, voting rights, and civil rights. But he said that it could not be done immediately, that it needed to be done sort of step by step, gradually. But he was on board with African American voting rights right off the bat for those who had served in combat, and then eventually over time, that all African American males eventually, eventually, would also receive the right to vote. All right, well, Reconstruction, in my opinion, is the beginning of second half American history. With the end of this war, the America that had existed comes to an end. With Reconstruction, we get into what Lincoln referred to as a new birth of freedom. Really, a new country emerges after the war. But that is second half American history. You'll have to take that class to get that information. So you can pat yourself on the back. Yay, you finished first half American history. Now getting through the Civil War. Okay, I'm also going to post a review, go over those possible essay topics that you guys can look at to prepare yourselves for the fourth exam. So I hope you enjoyed the semester. More than anything, I hope you learned something about your country. And I would ask each of you to go online and evaluate the class. If you go under Blackboard, you look on the left-hand side, there'll be a link that you can click for course evaluation. It just depends on what time of the semester it is that you're listening to this. But towards the end of the semester, they put up a link for course evaluation. Please fill those out. Please be as honest as you can about your feelings in the class. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed your semester. I wish you all nothing but the best of luck going forward in your academic life, your academic success, and life in general. Take care of yourselves. Bye.